faculties joining from the department, and also I can see few of my friends in the list from the different universities that have shown their interest to be part of this webinar, so I've invited them. So we have some faculties from Assam University, from Tripura University, and some few places, colleges and universities from Orissa. So thank you so much for joining us. So for the benefit of the students, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. I have known Alex for quite some time. It's almost a decade now, I guess. He was my senior at the university, University of Hyderabad. Dr. Alex Thomas has studied economics at the University of Madras, Hyderabad, and University of Sydney. Currently, he teaches at Azim Premji University, and his primary area of research is the history of economic thought. He has published numerous papers and also has contributed in so many books. So naming few of it can be the Artha Vijnana Economics and Economic and Political Weekly. He has also contributed his paper in the History of Economic Idea, History of Economic Review, and Journal of Interdisciplinary Economics. He has also co-edited book on the history of economic thought, which was published by the Routledge in 2019, and another one of this book is also coming up next year on the title Macroeconomics, an Introduction, which is expected to be published next year by Cambridge University Press. And he is also, nonetheless, he's also an active writer. He makes remarkable comment on his writing piece. He writes in magazine articles, newspaper, you can find him. He is a very active blog writer as well. The recent one that I read was on revisiting the economic thoughts of A.N. Raj, if I'm not mistaken, right, Alex? All right, so let me not quickly get into and just break the ice by introducing your topic. I leave that to you, Alex. But since we have a limit of still 5 o'clock, and unfortunately we have another meeting in the campus at 5 with the central campus, I have to constrain this webinar till 5 p.m. So what I was thinking is we should have 40 minutes of lecture time, and remaining 10 minutes we can have a questions and a deliberation time with the students. So over to you, Alex.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Renbeni, and I'm extremely delighted to be here. In fact, I think when we first discussed, I thought it would be an interactive session and maybe a few students, but now this is too large. So I shall try to keep my lecture short, and so that we have some time for question and answers. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you please, let me know if the screen is visible?
Yes, Alex, it's visible.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I'll try to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and what I'm going to talk about today is the political economy of India. I'm going to focus on theories, context, and policies. But before I begin, I would like to highlight that even before the COVID times, what I call invisible crises, these are some of the invisible crises that I would like to list. In the case of employment, there was severe wage disparities within the Indian economy. And this meant that people had to migrate, and people were forced to migrate. Besides wage disparities, it was also very clear and evident that there's a lack of decent employment or jobs. The state of public services, notably health and education, is also rather poor. And the third aspect, I think, is ecological, and there are two things here. The more catastrophic events like a tsunami or a flood is much more visible, but I think what is also happening is a kind of slow damage that is really invisible unless you're following what is happening to the ecological issues. So this is just to highlight that even before COVID, we were in some sort of a severe economic crisis. Now, what did the COVID-19 really do? I think that it made aspects of these crises much more visible. And my own way of thinking about it is to argue that I think this is a collective failure, by which I mean that all of us are responsible to it in various degrees. And particularly, I want to highlight three things here. I think that there is some sort of a failure in terms of ideas, in terms of our thinking, and may or may not have an impact on the policy. Right? So there's some, again, a problem with policy. There's also an issue in terms of how we are able to navigate politics. And in all this, one might wonder what is the role of universities. I think that universities such as Christ or any other university, I think is extremely important and play a very important role in generating new ideas, in terms of disseminating ideas, and in terms of how they might have an impact on policy and politics. I'm going to come back to it later when maybe towards the conclusion. So what is the title of my talk is Political Economy of India, and one can ask the question, what is political economy? And I mean, there are many ways in which you can try to understand India, but what are the relevant features of the Indian economy? So before I talk about political economy, I want to spend a little bit of time giving you the context of, I mean, how thought really progresses, or how we can think about how we think. And historically, when economics or when political economy began in the 1800s, it was called political economy. So if you look at Adam Smith's work, if you look at David Ricardo's work, or if you even go and look at people who were writing before and around that time, you notice that all of them use the word political economy. And there is a specific reason for this. It was because it was tied to public policy in a significant sense, and people also recognize the role of politics and political process and subsequently in the 1800s and late 1800s, with people like Jevons, Walras, and Menger, there was a fascination for physics and the natural sciences. So people then decided to change the term political economy to economics so as to sound more like one of the natural science subjects. So that's how political economy became economics, and slowly it moved away from its close association with subjects like philosophy and politics. So it became a standalone subject with, let's say, more courses in mathematics. Now, what happens recently, which is in the global financial crisis in 2007-8, economists were criticized severely from several quarters, and that has again led to some sort of interest in calling economics political economy. But as I'm going to presently tell you, there are various strands in which political economy is understood, and it has led to, I think, some sort of confusion as to what actually political economy means. And this is where various schools of thought or paradigms come in. So what you generally learn today, if you are going to study Samuelson or Mankiw or Hal Varian, what you will be studying is actually marginalist micro and macroeconomics. In other words, you're going to use concepts like marginal utility, marginal productivity. Looking at microeconomics and macroeconomics, you might be studying something which is what can be called Marxist, where they have a different set of categories, a different set of vocabulary to talk about the economy. And in fact, you can even think about a Smithian micro and macroeconomics. Again, we have a slightly different set of categories, although I would say that in case of Marxist and Smithian, there are also similarities. So depending on which paradigm or which school of thought you actually study, political economy can also mean something which is emanating from any of these schools of thought. In other words, you can have marginalist political economy. They might not call it marginalist, but underlying it would be marginal utility and such principles. You can have Marxist political economy. You can have Smithian political economy. So all these are possible. Now let me just briefly comment on the ruling ideas. Where do we get our ideas from? How do we know that this is dominant, or are all the ideas that we study, are there things which are being missed out? And this is a particularly interesting quote which I've taken from Karl Marx's The German Ideology. And let me read it out. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. Now, this is making a very strong argument, and I leave you to think about the implications of it. But what I would like to point out and to question here is, how does our economic syllabi, what we learn in economics, whether through textbooks or syllabus, have an impact, or is it close to what the ruling ideas are, and where is that coming from? So what is the political economy tradition in which I am going to explain what is happening in India, or at least make some remarks about what is happening in India? I'm going to talk in the tradition of Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx. I think many of you might know the first four names. Piero Staffa was an economist who wrote an important book in the 1960s where he revived some of the key ideas from Smith, Ricardo, and other classical economists. And subsequently, what you also have is the political economy tradition has taken or absorbed or has fused the Keynesian principle of effective demand, and together you might call it classical political economy, or what is called the surplus approach, or classical economics. So at this point, I think many of you might rightly wonder, but I learned about classical political economy as a different thing. Because if you look at any macroeconomics textbook, classical economics refers to all the economics that came before Keynes. Now, that kind of a characterization is not quite accurate if you were to think in terms of conceptual categories or paradigms. So, and let me also add here that Keynes was actually criticizing Alfred Marshall and Arthur Pigou, who actually are marginalist economists. He had some dissatisfaction with Ricardo, but that is for a different reason, but he was not really criticizing the others. For instance, let me also add here that all these economists, Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, all of them in their theories, you notice that there is a tendency to unemployment of labor. And Keynes's principal criticism was against Marshall and Pigou, who argued that there would be a tendency to the full employment of labor. Okay, so let me sort of identify some key points in terms of theory and context. So the theory that mainly most of us learn is what is applicable to a freely competitive economy. Now, although all of us know that that's not how the real world operates or the actual world operates, there is a reason for studying it, because once we know that, that acts like a benchmark, and then we say that there might be certain imperfections, and this is how the real world operates. One of the key assumptions of this is the free mobility of labor and capital. And I think there is another implicit kind of idea which is embedded in a perfectly competitive economy, and that is the idea of capitalism, or I should maybe call it the ideal of capitalism, where there is some sort of implicit favoring of, as I shall argue, efficiency, and it is the same kind of implicit favoring of efficiency which comes up when we talk about surplus labor, we talk about allocative efficiency, we talk about productivity. And my question here is, how do we think of this meaningfully, or maybe in a more ethical fashion, in labor-rich economies like India? What is the use of such theories in labor-rich economies like India? Now let me move on to the context. I would argue that Indian capitalism, one can come up with many different aspects of it, but to me, I would like to highlight caste, gender, and the effect of colonialism. And in fact, I think rather than calling it capitalism, it is much more accurate to call it capitalisms in the plural, because there is a variety of capitalism. Now, I've put, what is, one might not really understand what I mean by that, what I'm trying to say is, and what I want to draw your attention to is the connect or the disconnect between theory, our understanding of context, and policy. And it is at these interconnections that I want you to sort of meditate. So one, at the realm of theory, you can ask the question, which theory? Now there are so many different paradigms. Which paradigm do you choose? Let's say that you have chosen a theory, and then you move on to the context. Again, is the transference of these theoretical notions to the context very smooth? It need not be. Again, you need caution. What aspects of the context are you going to actually consider? And let's say you've considered certain aspects. From theory, context to policy, again, there is a vast difference, because I might say that there is something called the Indian context, but this context might be very different for Bangalore. It could be very different for, let's say, Kohima, or it could be very different for Delhi, or it could be very different for Patna. And so it really depends on what kind of context are we talking about. So having made that statement about how one should be cautious when you move from theory to context and context to policy, let me talk a little bit about what I mean by political economy and where my definition is coming from. My definition is coming from, I'm adopting Smith's definition, where if I were to rephrase, his idea of political economy is a study of mechanisms which produce and distribute the social surplus. And the reason for this is to ensure an adequate consumption for all. So per capita consumption, maximize per capita consumption, and not necessarily, again, when we say consumption, this is not to say that we become consumerist. I think one needs to draw a distinction between consumption and consumerism. The other aspect of Smith is that he believed that political economy is always at the service of public policy. And these are some of the concepts that I just want you to introduce you to. One is the idea of necessaries and luxuries, and these are concepts that you don't really find anymore. And I think that there is genuine value in going back to these concepts, because they have a significant social connection. And today, I think in economics, we have lost that social connection, because we start with the Robinson Crusoe economy and we talk about independent preferences. The other social aspect in Smith is Smith talks about social rank, Smith talks about social classes, and in our context, I think we need to include the social institutions of caste and gender to make better sense of our economic surroundings. So what are some of the, again, some of the features of Indian capitalism? One is the fact that there is significant inequality in terms of the ownership of assets, especially land. And land is an important endowment. This I don't need to repeat, but notably caste system and patriarchy, it means that labor becomes significantly immobile. You cannot easily move from one job to another or from one place to another. And caste system also exacerbates or contributes to intergenerational immobility of labor. What about our markets? Some of our markets are oligopolistic in nature. We have a significant informal sector, and several of the agricultural markets are interlinked in nature. This is a concept that I've borrowed from Krishna Bharadwaj, where she uses this term to talk about how the market for seed, the market for credit, the market for, let's say, tractors, all in agriculture can sometimes be interlinked or interlocked. And this creates significant issues of power in the agriculture sector. I think that Indian capitalism does provide some sort of necessaries. There is some public education, there is some public health, there is some notion of employment insurance in the form of NREGA. And I think that these are really necessary. And I'm intentionally not using the more common word, which is a public good, because I think there are some marginless connections which I do not want to make, and I think that they might be more appropriately called necessaries using Adam Smith's term. In terms of public policy, As we know, the Reserve Bank of India has a significant role to play. But there are also central governments, state governments, and local governments, and within all of them, there are different ministries which undertake public policy. And there is also an issue of how these things are coordinated, and I think this is also a key factor when we want to understand Indian capitalism. My focus today is going to be, there are many things one can talk about, but I'm just going to focus on 4 aspects: employment, income distribution, economic growth, and ecology. So this is actually a chart which is about the US economy. Now the reason I put this chart here is really because often for our ideas, for our policies, we look up to the American economy. We look up to American textbooks, we look up to American research for various reasons. But if you look at what is happening to the American economy, it's quite surprising. So the way to read the graph is not to look at, it's not a time series. So there are only 2 time points here. One is 1980 and the other is 2014. But what is very clear is that in 1980, I think it was much more equitable. But when you look at 2014, you notice that largest income growth is happening only at the very top tiers. So this just alerts you to significant income inequality. This is another chart. This is just to show the income inequality in the case of India, but it is only up to 2013 or so. And it shows a widening gap between those who have and those who don't have. In this case, if you look at the legend, you're just talking about the top 10% share and the bottom 50%. Remember, we are talking about top 10% and not bottom 10%, but bottom 50%. And what you notice here is again a divergence in terms of incomes. So now let me get into the theories a little bit. So when you look at mainstream marginalist economics, the kind of theories, what they suggest is that growth will automatically create jobs. So all you need to do is focus on growth and you will get employment. Mainstream marginalist economics also sort of favors austerity, the idea that the government is some kind of an individual and therefore the government must spend within its means, and therefore India also has follows the FRBM Act, which is the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act. The third thing is the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, which all of you would have studied, which is that under conditions of competition in equilibrium, your wage equals the marginal product of labor and the rate of profit equals the marginal product of capital. Under this, you conceptualize supply and demand as schedules. There is a certain symmetry between supply and demand. Sometimes one feels happy seeing this symmetry, but the question to ask is that the right idea? Does that how reality works? But political economy argues differently. It argues that growth needs to be planned and directed for it to create appropriate and adequate jobs. In response to austerity, this is an idea particularly which is there in Keynes, but it is also there in some form in Malthus, it is also there in some form in Marx. Talks about the fallacy of composition and particularly argues that if the governments were to spend more, you're actually going to crowd in and not crowd out. Wages are determined through customs and history, according to political economy. So there is a much more active role for policies and politics. So supply and demand, there is supply and demand in political economy, especially I'm talking about Smith and others. Supply and demand are understood as points, so just as points and not as schedules. And in all their work, there is a certain asymmetry between supply and demand, notably that supply adapts to demand. So let me move on to the theories relevant to income distribution. The core theory is the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. As I mentioned before, what it is really a very harmonious account of income distribution. In some sense, it tells you that I'm going to get whatever I contribute. I'm going to be compensated for my effort. It is a very just state of affairs. And let's say that marginalist economics has to somehow accommodate power. It can do so. It will say that the market is imperfect. Right? So there are some imperfections in the market, and therefore we can talk about power. In political economy, income distribution is largely a product of, as I said, history and politics and customs. And what you have is a conflictual account. There is a conflict between workers and capitalists. It really reflects, in some sense, an unjust state of affairs. And even in a freely competitive economy, these economists talk about the role of structural power. So this, mind you, these two are very, very different ways of understanding our economic surroundings. Now let's look at economic growth. Most of you would have studied Robert Solow's growth theory. Robert Solow's growth theory can be characterized as a supply-side growth theory, which operates in the paradigm of marginalist economics. In a way, growth is the result of the growth of endowments, or in this case, let's say the growth of population and technological progress, or total factor productivity. That's what drives growth. There is a tendency, or there's always full employment of labor. There is no aggregate demand deficiency in Solow growth model or those class of growth models. But political economy, again, which is synthesized with the Keynesian idea of the principle of effective demand, and it is called demand-led growth theory. Recent research in demand-led growth theory points out that what is really important is the growth in autonomous elements of aggregate demand. Now, these autonomous elements could be autonomous consumption, it could be government expenditure, it could be exports. So or it could also be autonomous investment in some form. In this class of growth theories, there is no tendency to the full employment of labor. And there is a significant possibility of aggregate demand deficiency. Again, recall and to reiterate that these two theories are talking about the same economic surroundings, but they have a very different way of understanding it. Now, the fourth point is about ecology and the different theories in the realm of ecology. According to mainstream marginalist economics, the source of value is really utility, and I must add, individual utility. Economics is seen to be the study of an independent individual. An individual which is asocial. Ecology is often studied within this term of public good. And I've just mentioned Nordhaus because Nordhaus extends Solow's growth theory to the environment, but there's no real role for collective policies or politics. In contrast, and if you go to political economy and the kind of work that was published in early 1700 or late 1600s, sorry, there is a typo there, should be sources of value. What you notice is land is also seen as a source of value. And I think this is particularly important today when we have, or there's a lot of importance given to the environment. Apart from labor theory of value is the more popularly or most well-known source of value in political economy. But if you go further back, before Adam Smith, to the physiocrats or to Kenney, or even before that to William Petty, you notice that land provides value, and land is understood broadly as natural resources. And in political economy, economics is embedded in social norms and wishes. And political economy is much more analytically open to collective politics and policies. And I've just highlighted necessaries here to indicate how necessaries has a very social connotation to it. There is the role of ethics, there is the notion of justice embedded in it, whereas the idea of public good is really a sort of reaction to what happens in a perfectly competitive market. It suggests that only if the market is unable to produce this good, should the government produce the good. There is no wider role for ethics, there's no wider role for social norms, there's no wider role for politics. So I want you to again sort of meditate or think a bit more about this distinction, this conceptual distinction that I'm making between public good, which is there in marginalist economics, and necessaries. Now, quickly, let me just review some of these contexts. So, context in terms of India, we have socioeconomic inequalities in form of caste, gender, land, income. There is interlinked markets. There is collusion. There are social power structures. And we know that there is an inability to access good education and health facilities. And of course, there are regional differences, so the context has to be appropriately understood. The other thing maybe I want to highlight, I've used the term public here, but not in the form of public goods really, but a more a social science or a wider notion of public, but there's been some sort of decay of public, and that's also probably because we don't understand the meaning of necessaries. So for instance, Adam Smith would argue that education is a necessary element. It's not a good, it is just a necessary thing. Right? Health is necessary, transportation is necessary, waste management is necessary, parks for recreation is necessary. There are many things that are necessary, and these have to be understood as necessaries and not as something that we will think of at a later stage if the market is not able to produce. Just to again repeat and reiterate, in the past we've had inequalities in the form of caste system, patriarchy, and class. In the present, these inequalities continue. The question is, how do we want our future to be? And I think this particular quotation from Marx is important. Marx, in his volume 1 of Capital, writes about this in the part 6, which is, I think, primitive accumulation, where he talks of, the concept of primitive accumulation is the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. I've put a slash there because technically we think of it as something that has happened before, but if you actually look around, you notice that this is an ongoing process. So now I'm coming to the last maybe 5 to 10 minutes of the presentation. In terms of policies, we want to generate policies for labor and employment. We want to generate policies for income distribution, economic growth, for the environment. And I'm not really going to talk about specific policies because, as I mentioned before, I think that requires a knowledge of the specific context and depends on the specific location. I'm just going to give you certain broad templates to think about it and how one might go forward. And my question really is, how can a policy for employment not be connected with, let's say, an income distribution policy, a wages policy, or a competition policy, or a growth policy? Or how can an ecological policy be disconnected from an employment policy or wages policy? So let me just reflect or highlight some of the key aspects when we move from theories to policies. Theories, in some way, whether it's a model, it's a formal explanation of a phenomena which is happening under some given conditions, like in equilibrium conditions where we made certain assumptions. It uses concepts, it uses models. Some of the theories in marginalist economics uses partial equilibrium. So when you study demand and supply or the consumer theory, you're saying that you're just going to focus on this market and you're going to forget about the other markets. And in the realm of theories, often a fragmented approach is quite helpful because we get to understand the phenomenon a bit more deeply. But policies are not just like that. There is significant impact on lives and livelihoods. Economic theories can be one of the inputs, but the issues are interconnected. Which, in other words, if I were to use an economic term, some sort of general equilibrium understanding is warranted when it comes to policies. In other words, I would argue that an integrated and a coordinated policy is required if just for these 4 aspects that I mentioned, if we want to really address the situation. And here, let me just give you an example. I think this was in the budget document 2 years back. When I was looking at it, in one part, they said that we are going to construct roads. On the other part, they said that we are going to invest in solar panels. But the question is, even if you're constructing roads, are you actually felling trees? Is it forested area? Is the road being laid over villages that they might not really want that road? So I think that there requires some more coordination between ecological policies, growth policies, wages policies, competition policies, etc. And to conclude, really, I think what I wanted to highlight with this talk, and I hope that I've highlighted, is it is very important to have a critical understanding of theories and their associated paradigms, because all of them have certain implications which sometimes might be not very visible. So a critical understanding is absolutely essential. And I think that one needs to be a bit more humble about the context. Although with technology, there is a lot of data, you have big data, but I think there is a certain element of humility which is important when we are trying to understand our surroundings. One should also look at qualitative data, whether it is ethnography, it could be personal accounts, it could be oral accounts. So I think that one needs to widen the way in which we think of understanding the context. I think it's also important that we acknowledge the limit of economics. There is only so much economic theory can really do. And I think here it is very important to have more conversation with other social sciences. And the question can be asked, why should only economists occupy so much of importance in policy making? I would argue that policy making should be a more collective process. And in all this, I think universities play an extremely critical role because in a way, all the 3 points that I mentioned before, a critical understanding of theories, some sort of humility when it comes to understanding the context, and the limits of economics can really be disseminated and taught very well through our curriculum. So just 2 more slides. In terms of how do we learn economics, and I've put Paul Samuelson here. I mean, I've got nothing against Paul Samuelson, but this is just to say that often we learn these books which are mainstream and which is considered Econ 101. And to use Keynes's words, it is often a struggle to escape from these notions that we might have learned since school or since college or for many years. So it's very important to explore other ways of understanding the world, or it is very important to explore other paradigms. So which is why I've got learning. Learning also is a process of unlearning simultaneously. And I'm going to end with this slide. This is, of course, this is sort of taken from a quotation from John Maynard Keynes, and I've added a little bit. So this illustration is just to show that it is important for a student of economics to actually pay attention to politics, also pay attention to philosophy, read history, understand experiences, be a mathematician. Right? So this is, I mean, I've just mentioned the source also there before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a very rich and very crisp content. I'm sure the students must have enjoyed your session. We are very much on time. It's 4:43 I can see in my time, and I can also see that we have a good number of questions. So what I'm going to do is I am either going to give chance to the students to unmute themselves, and maybe we can have an interaction in that way, and I can give chance to the students who have put the, I'm sure you must have, you can see the chat box, Alex. I can ask the student to unmute themselves and share the queries with you directly instead of I passing it through. Dana, can you just unmute yourself and can you just post your question here?
So I think maybe I can respond to some of the questions that have already come up on chat. Let me try to respond to them. Yeah, so the first one of the question is, can you elaborate on informal sectors being capitalist components? So if we were to, okay, so maybe the other way to think of it is India capitalist? The answer would be yes and no. So there are elements which one would consider is capitalist elements, there are elements which you might consider are not. So what I really had in mind is maybe we should, either we can, give up the term capitalism completely and think of some other term which is maybe like a mixed economy, that is fine. So that is what I had in mind, and really it was more about underscoring the fact that we have a significant informal sector in the Indian economy. The second question is, how can we view tragedy of commons under the role of ethics, and what is the role of the government inside the structure of ethics with respect to reference to the environment? Okay, let me. So I think I might take a different route here and argue that it might be very different for theory, economic theory, to really say anything about this whatsoever. Because let's say that I have a particular view of how water should be used sitting in Bangalore. But let's say I go somewhere else and I say that this is how you should use water because this is what the theory says. But there might have been a more traditional way of engaging or dealing with water, which might be very different from what I have in mind. So the point really is, I don't think we can have a very formal model theoretical mechanism of understanding some of these things, and they have to really be a social process. Okay, the next question is, social mobility is the promise on which capitalism has been sold. What is the relation between the two? Okay. All right. So without getting into capitalism so much, because that is a much larger debate, if I were to try and bring it down to a perfectly competitive economy. So the way in which I'm understanding it is, people think that capitalism has a lot of merits to offer, and one of the things is because people think that perfectly competitive economy from a marginless framework is it is efficient. If everything were to work well, then you're going to get fair wages or you're going to be adequately compensated. So I think that these the way in which capitalism has been understood by many, some of them can be really tied down to your demand and supply framework. Right? And my engagement is at that level, at the realm of ideas and what we learn in economics textbooks, and I think that the problem lies there. So okay, let me read out the question. Whenever there has been a new world order, such as globalization or the industrial revolution, it has always affected the labor market and has contributed to widening socioeconomic inequalities. Do you think we'll see something similar with the world moving towards a remote world culture? Will we see a pivot in the kind of labor policies that exist? Okay, so I can easily answer this question because the answer is I don't know. Okay, so the next question is, how do you think the ignorance of Joan Robinson's work by neoclassicals and now most modern economics has affected our view of microeconomics? Okay. I think this is an important point. Joan Robinson and Michelle Keletsky, Keynes, many others who were writing out of Cambridge, I think developed they had a different view of how the world works. But increasingly, if you look at a microeconomics textbook today, you notice that there is only one way of understanding the world. Whereas there are so many different ways of understanding the world. You could have, you could read Joan Robinson and have a different understanding of microeconomics. You could read Karl Marx and have a very different understanding of microeconomics. You could read Adam Smith and have a very different understanding of microeconomics. And I think that it is important that these ideas are brought back.
Alex, sorry to interrupt, but I can also see there are a few number of questions being sent to the panelists, if you could see that. Maybe I can ask the students to just unmute the mic and maybe we can have an interaction that way as well. Or else it will be exhausting for you, Alex, if you just read out. I'm assuming that you are collecting different sets of questions, and over here also I can see a few questions to the panelists.
Okay.
Shall we do that? Maybe how many questions are you able to see in your chat box, Alex?
Just let me
Have you
check.
exhausted the questions?
No, I haven't. But okay, now I can't open the chat box. Okay, wait. I think I forgot. Yeah, so I think there are two more questions that I see.
All right, then you can just finish that, and maybe I can take over the questions that have come up in my list.
Okay, sure. So, how does government spending lead to crowding in? Okay, and the next question, because I don't know the answer, I'm not going to read it out. So, the usual understanding of crowding out is based on the assumption of full employment, which is really a marginalist assumption which comes from Say's law. But if you are talking about an economy which Smiths or Ricardo or Marx or other people conceptualized, or Keynes, you don't have you don't have full employment, you have underemployment or you have unemployment. If government is actually going to spend more, it means that it's going to create more employment and more output because of the multiplier process. The next question is, what role do you think empathy has in policy making and eliminating social inequalities? Again, I think this is an important question, but I don't think I have the necessary expertise or the understanding to respond to that.
All right, Alex, I think this one question that has come up is in relation to the previous question that you have addressed. If I'm not mistaken, and I also believe that that's the same question. She has asked, sir, could you please explain the government spending lead to crowding in? Also, do you think there is a stark bifurcation of conservative and liberal policy that is unhealthy for public policy discourse?
Yeah, so I think that I just responded to the first part, and I didn't read out the second part because I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
All right. So the next question is, what role do you think does empathy have? I think that's also you have.
Yeah, I've responded.
Yes, okay. The last one that I can see is, how do we rectify the gap between the changing context and the education that we receive?
Let me just try and go back to the chat and see what was the question. How do we rectify the gap between the changing context and the education that we receive?
Right.
Okay, so one, I'm not so sure that the changing context we need to, I mean, it's not really about the changing context. I think these inequalities, they've been there maybe forever. Right, but I think what has happened is a certain maybe commercialization of education on one hand, and a certain professionalization of economics on the other, and they've sort of gone in and with each other. So I think that universities should be places where ideas are debated, discussed, new ideas are brought in. It should be a safe space where we can really bring in any idea that we want, but we engage with it critically, constructively, and but the important, again, to highlight, I think it is important to have a pluralism of ideas, a pluralism of methods, because otherwise we'll just look at the world through one lens, and we might think that this is the only way of understanding the world, where there are so many other ways of understanding our economic surroundings.
All right. I think we have exhausted the questions in the chat box. Now maybe I can give 2 more minutes for the students if they want to unmute and if someone wants to speak up. Okay. So if there is none, then it also looks like we are almost exhausting our time that is allotted for our webinar, and maybe we can go ahead. And in between, if someone wants to ask some question, I can still be flexible, and maybe we can go for another one more question if someone wants to come up with as we wind up the session. All right. So meantime, let me just make use of a few minutes that we have. Like I mentioned in the beginning, unfortunately, I have to move on for one more session at 5 o'clock, which was quite unplanned. It just suddenly came up, or else I could have just rearranged or rescheduled our webinar so that we have enough time to have more interaction time with students. But I think we have to wind up that way. But before we leave, I must say, Alex, that was a very interesting and very thoughtful revisit to the economic thoughts and the theories connecting to the Indian capitalism and the Indian political theory. And I'm sure, and I believe that our students have deeper understanding on this, and maybe and through your lecture, your intellect and deliberations, I'm sure my students have gained more wider perspective, and they must have seen the different spectrum which were not discussed in the class. So thank you, Alex, for your patience and for your time. And I also thank all the participants. And before we move out, I also want to thank the Department of Economics, and especially to our HOD and to our team, George Kumar and Emmanuel sir, for constantly supporting us and for making this webinar happen. All right, so thank you so much, and we are 5 minutes ahead of the time. We are quite punctual for the day. Thank you so much, Alex. Once again, I look forward to see you in person in Bangalore. Stay safe and be active in your writing. I look forward for reading more of your piece. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, students, and thank you all my friends who have joined the session. And maybe we can wind up. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.